Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War, Shogun 2, and Follow Samurai, and why they are some of the best Total War games to play at the moment, alongside Medieval 2 and the Warhammer games. Rome 1 has issues, Rome 2 has issues, Attila has issues, Free Kingdoms was abandoned. I mean, Free Kingdoms is playable, so is Troy playable, but they are unfinished. Both Troy and Free Kingdoms were just unfinished games. If Creative Assembly had continued developing them, they might have ended up being far better than they currently are. Though to be clear, Free Kingdoms and Troy are still playable games. But here's what makes Shogun 2, even though it was released over a decade ago, here's what makes Shogun 2 and Follow Samurai some of the best Total War games to play at the moment. One, they run quite well at the moment on modern systems. They didn't run so well when they came out, crashing issues, lag issues, performance issues, and so on and so forth. But you can load these games up on a modern computer and they will run quite well. I haven't had any issues playing them on Windows 11 with the modern computer. The way the UI scaling is handled, the way the settings are handled. There are certainly some control changes between Shogun 2 and Warhammer, like you can't just alt and drag units to move your entire formation forward. There are some limitations, but overall they handle exceptionally well. So does Medieval 2, though Medieval 2 has issues in terms of battles, but it handles quite well in terms of the campaign side of things, and while the battles have issues, they're still pretty playable. So from a performance perspective and from the perspective of getting them to run on a modern system, they handle quite well in a way that a lot of other Total War games just don't. Like playing Rome 2 or Attila on a modern system is just not really a great experience from a lot of perspectives. That's what I would have to say on that subject. But what also makes Shogun 2 really good is that it has an amazing atmosphere, it has amazing graphics. Sure, they are outdated on a technical level, but there was a lot of love and care put into this game when it came to presentation, when it came to the sound design, when it came to the music. Given the fact that we have general speeches, at least in the Sengoku Jidai period, not so much in Fall of Samurai. Also, ignore Rise of Samurai, not worth playing. But we do have general speeches. We just have that extra touch in Shogun 2 that a lot of other Total War games didn't have. Now, what's interesting to think about Shogun 2 is that it's basically a follow-up to Empire Napoleon. Basically, all the work that Creative Assembly had put in developing Empire, then quote-unquote fixing Empire, which they never did fully, I might add. All the work they put in Empire, all the work they put in Napoleon, the payoff ultimately was in Shogun 2. And because it's a more limited game, or everyone basically has the same roster of units and agents, they did focus on polish more in Shogun 2 than they did in other Total War games, and it shows. Now, the caveat to all of this is that I would strongly recommend people play with mods, specifically mods that increase accessibility to research, to the tech tree, to units, to economy, that improve your economy. And I have a list of mods in the description of this video that I would highly recommend if you're going to play Shogun 2. That's not to say Shogun 2 isn't playable without mods. In fact, it is very playable without mods. It's just the more limited campaign you're going to have. See, the problem with Shogun 2 is that a lot of things are gated behind research. So you need to get research to be able to get the building, then you can construct a unit. And this is not a great situation because, as in every other Total War game, it's really the early game of a campaign that is the most relevant to your experience. So like the first 40, 60 turns is what really, really matters. The first campaign I beat the Shogun 2 back in the day as the Uesugi, I did that in 63 turns or so. And while you can certainly do it even faster, the point is, given the pacing of the campaign, and given the way the AI cheats on higher difficulties, because that campaign I beat was on Legendary, given the AI cheats, you really want to be an aggressive expansionist. This applies in every Total War game. There really isn't a Total War game where that doesn't work very well. But the problem is, with all the gatekeeping that does happen by default, you won't have access to the entire toolbox. And it's a great toolbox between infantry units or ground units, land units, and sea units, and agents. There's a lot of fun to be had on both campaign and battles when you have access to that toolbox. So the mods I recommend are designed to just give you that greater access, which makes for an overall better experience, I'd argue, in Shogun 2. That's my perspective, though. Again, you can play it without mods. That's the only real caveat. There's some issues. The AI is not that great, and it does cheat quite heavily. There's a lot of questionable decisions that AI does make on both campaign and in battles. There's tactics that it uses in battles that don't hold up quite well. But overall, the way the game plays out, the way it's designed, and the focus campaign that Shogun 2 has is a really great one. It shows that you can have a more limited campaign in Total War and still be a great experience. Like Shogun 2 is the ultimate example of that. So is Napoleon a good example of that, and I would really consider Shogun 2, more so than anything else, a successor to what Creative Assembly was doing in Napoleon with a more focused campaign. And that's what they achieve over here. Now, in terms of the land battles, when it comes to the unit matchups, well, cavalry is very much a glass cannon. Any type of cavalry is very much a glass cannon. They'll die very quickly, even against fairly basic infantry. Like Yari Ashigaru, the basic spear unit, can defeat high-tier cavalry, or can do a significant amount of damage. Also, because of AI cheats, then yeah, the situation with cavalry certainly doesn't work out quite well, especially as a player. And it doesn't work quite well for the AI either, even though the AI will try and cycle charge very quickly. The speed of units, the amount of damage that cavalry will take is not that great. It makes that cavalry is not great, especially in a stand-up fight. Basically, the way to view cavalry in Shogun 2 is all about charging, cycle charging again and again and again. The problem is that it's kind of finicky, and cavalry does end up being far less useful than it should be. I would love to play the Takeda and go with the full cavalry army. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work quite well. Range cavalry, different discussion, but you will have to use a lot of micro. So cavalry can do a lot of damage through charging, but won't hold up in a stand-up fight. They're particularly useful at dealing with enemy artillery and dealing with enemy ranged units. However, they get hard countered by sword infantry and especially spear infantry and Naginata infantry as well. They get hard countered by those types of infantry, to the point that even when you launch devastating flank attack on spear units, yeah, you'll lose some damage in charge, but if you don't get out of there pretty quickly, you'll start losing cavalry units very, very, very quickly. So cav won't hold up well against any kind of spear unit. But spear units get countered by sword infantry units, so Yari Ashigaru, Yari Spearman, or any kind of spear unit that you have will get hard countered by sword units. So Katana Samurai, Nodachi Samurai, they'll hard counter spear units. But in turn, where sword infantry is more vulnerable is against range units, of course, gunpowder units and bow units. Though it should be pointed out that a spear wall formation is the most durable infantry formation you can have. So if you form a spear wall, a wall of literal spears, of pikes really, a pike wall, and you can embrace the idea of pike and shot in Shogun 2, because yes, it is a follow-up to Empire and Napoleon, so of course pike and shot does work. If you embrace the idea of pike and shot in Shogun 2, then you can form a fairly durable front line that will not be easily killed. Sword infantry units will eventually win, but they will take significant damage in the process. So forming that spear wall can negate a lot of the benefits that sword infantry units have. So it's not a simple counter system where it's like, oh, this unit beats that unit. No, it's like spear units can hold up against sword infantry units, but if sword infantry units get the jump on spear infantry units, and especially if you do a banzai charge or a charge in general, and the spear infantry units can't use their spears and they switch to swords, they'll get slaughtered in that matchup. Then you have the range situation. Obviously, artillery does a significant amount of damage, but it is very vulnerable. So the way artillery works is that it will devastate units, but it's very easy to get it killed. And the problem is the accuracy of artillery is not necessarily the greatest. The damage there is there, and I do like the way that they design the system, whereas if you get hit by a cannon, you're going to be pulverized. The problem is that artillery may not have the accuracy to do something like that. And by the way, there's a lot of active abilities in Shogun 2, like that artillery units have, infantry units have. People complained about this, by the way, in Rome too. Oh, there was a lot of buttons. I kind of think like the way they handled it in Shogun 2 was significantly better than in many other Total War games. From that particular perspective. It could have handled things differently, absolutely, but I think the way Creative Assembly decided to handle things was really good. Mods can change this around, so you can use things like Darth mod, you can use things like Radius. I do recommend Radius more so than Darth mod. There's some issues with getting Darth mod to run over here because it hasn't been updated in a very, very long time. So you have the land battle situation with a system of quote-unquote counters, but it's never that simple. The one thing that kind of lets it down, one, is that the AI does cheat, obviously, on higher difficulties. And the way it cheats, it's not necessarily stat benefits that they get, though I do believe they have them. It's more so the AI on the campaign will get a significant amount of free experience per turn. You know how in Warhammer 2, the AI could get ridiculously experienced units and pulverize you with those experience units? Yeah, that is happening in Shogun 2, unfortunately. And the way experience works in Shogun 2, it means that high rank units can be incredibly dangerous and absolutely annihilate your entire army. However, general sniping is very important. Morale shocks in general in Shogun 2 are quite important. Doing devastating flank attacks, you might just rout an entire unit. Killing their enemy, their general, can win you the battle outright. Morale shocks do matter in a way that they don't in many other Total War games. I mean, they do in other games as well, but if Pharaoh is an extreme example where morale shocks don't matter and units will basically fight until death, Shogun 2 is the exact opposite. Though it more so comes down to flanking and killing generals, because units will fight tooth and nail, especially in a siege on the defense, they'll fight until death, or even as an attacker, as long as your general is alive, they'll fight tooth and nail. But if you kill the general, if you do flanking attacks, and armies will rout very, very quickly. When it comes to sea battles, unfortunately, I think the sea battles of the Sengoku Jidai, so the vanilla version of Shogun 2, are just not really that great. You have a variety of ships, from lighter ships with greater range firepower to bigger ships with more melee power, all that. But I do think that the naval battles do leave a lot to be desired. The naval mechanics that exist in Shogun 2 are obviously based on Empire and Napoleon, so range combat works well, melee combat less well, and I wouldn't say the naval battles are really that interesting, unless you use the gunpowder ships. You get the Naban trade corridors, you get Portuguese ships, and you devastate your enemy with them. But range combat works, melee combat doesn't work at sea. All the problems that Rome 2 would have were here in Shogun 2. They just weren't that big of a deal. One of the things I would say, though, about naval battles, like the naval battles of Fallen Samurai are amazing. Easily the best naval battles in the entire series. Like, watching ironclads and steamships go toe-to-toe against one another and devastate one another never gets old. Blowing up an entire enemy fleet never gets old. It is quite fun when it happens. The downside of naval battles is that, while the mechanics of them are quite good in Fallen Samurai, one, you're limited by research, and even if you use mods to unlock things, the AI is just not going to be able to keep up with you. So unfortunately, naval combat doesn't end up working quite well because no one really builds massive fleets. I would actually love to play an entire campaign focused on naval dominance, but it just doesn't really happen in Fall of Samurai. It is unfortunate. The mechanics are there. They work quite well in Fall of Samurai, but just you never really encounter those kind of naval battles, unfortunately. The amount of naval units AI builds isn't conducive towards it working for him, and the problem is that the auto-resolve when it comes to naval combat is extremely punishing. Like, if you fight the battle, and this applies to the AI, because the AI will take a significant amount of damage as well, and also you don't have replenishment type ships, you have to go repair them, so it's really a problem, the AI letting the system down, because the AI could build significant fleets, they just end up losing a lot of ships throughout the course of the campaign. The mechanics work, it's just the combination of the campaign situation AI behavior that lets these sea battles down, but the mechanics are quite good. As for sieges, I think the sieges in Shogun 2 and Fall of Samurai are overall the best sieges in the entire series. That's because the sieges that exist in every other game are just not designed that well. They're kind of like what I would describe, when you think about the sieges that exist in other Total War games, they're the Hollywood sieges. They're not realistic at all. They're not historically accurate. People want to think like sieges or this bloodbath of an affair in a fortified settlement would be very difficult to take. Yes, there are many examples of that happening. There are far more examples, if not the overwhelming vast majority of sieges in history, which were over very quickly, either because they were taken by a quick assault, or because the defender surrendered, or because they didn't prepare. Holding a castle in the medieval era or any period required a significant amount of supply. Once you run out, if you didn't have preparation beforehand, well, you were going to starve in very short order. And that was one of the problems that did exist in sieges. Look at Jeanne d'Arc, her campaign, her Loire campaign. In the aftermath of the Siege of Orleans, and the aftermath of the Battle of Patay, Jeanne d'Arc, she engaged on a campaign to take a bunch of English fortified settlements, fortresses, cities, towns, villages, and she encountered some resistance, but she was able to take a significant amount of these very, very quickly. And this applies throughout history. There's many examples in history where for every battle, like the Siege of Antioch, like every siege like the Siege of Antioch, you have a siege like Jerusalem, for instance, or even worse for the defender. Like the First Crusade, Siege of Jerusalem, it was over in a month, and they had to literally build siege equipment from scratch. And the defender in that case was actually prepared. Many examples like that. That's one of the problems with sieges in Total War, is like there's this mythology that exists about how warfare is fought, and Total War is like kind of like more like Hollywood than actual historical accuracy, and it's always been like that. When we're talking about those sieges of Shogun 2, what I like about them is, one, they're dynamic. So every unit, minus cavalry of course, but units can climb up walls, but they take damage from that. Now, people have complained about this. I don't think it really matters. Like, again, the historical accuracy argument doesn't make sense, really, because, again, they're not. Sieges have never been. So what's important from my perspective is the gameplay. Are the systems in the gameplay conducive towards a good experience? And in Shogun 2, they are. The layouts of castles are open, so much so they can have an entire stack deployed properly and defend the settlement properly. You have to defend from multiple angles. Yes, you do have a capture point at the top of it, but Shogun 2 has the only sieges in the entire series where you have tiered defenses, multiple levels, and you have to fight for those levels, and you have gates block access to those higher levels. Gee, imagine if we had that in a modern Total War game. Yeah, imagine that. I mean, they have their issues, absolutely, and there are things that can be cheesed with this, but I have to say that playing these siege battles is a treat compared to the misery that sieges are in the Warhammer games and really in every other Total War game that exists. Minus Medieval 2 to some extent, but even then, like, Shogun 2 sieges are significantly better than Medieval 2. The layout is better, the mechanics are better, the fact that the pathfinding is better, the AI is actually better at defending than many other Total War games. It is quite incredible. And, well, in general, I would say the AI is really bad at offensive action, like when you're fighting a battle and the AI is going to attack you, then it's very easy to defeat the AI because its tactics are stupid, and you can easily general snipe and they'll suicide their general very, very easily. And since generals are important, it doesn't end up going so well for them. But on the defense, the AI is substantially better. Yes, there are things you can cheese, like you can just send the unit of bowmen in such an angle when you're attacking a castle that they'll hit the bowmen that are on the walls, and the AI won't move their bowmen, and they'll just take the damage. So there are things that you can certainly exploit in that, but overall, sieges end up just feeling significantly better. The way they play out, the way they feel, combined with, obviously, the great atmosphere and the great sound design, really, of the game. Talking about sound design, this is the last game that Jeff Van Dyke, who composed the soundtrack for Rome 1 and Medieval 2, this is the last game they had him working on Total War. And it really shows. So you have a great atmosphere, you have a great experience overall in the battles. To talk about the campaign situation, here's how it plays out. Everyone has access to the same kind of units, access to the same economy. The difference between factions comes down to certain faction effects that push you down a particular playstyle more so than others. Like, for instance, the Hojo, which I've played over here in this particular campaign, and this campaign is won. So I've taken Kyoto, I've made myself Shogun, I have the short campaign victory conditions. I do like the fact that you do have the ability of playing a shorter campaign because, as I've stated, the meat of any campaign is in the early game, so you do get to experience that earlier on over here, so you can play a campaign faster over here and get it over with quicker instead of the grind that can happen virtually every Total War game once you reach a certain point that isn't necessarily that great. So the campaign variety comes down from these kind of effects. So Hojo have cheaper castles, they reduce recruitment costs for siege units, and can recruit superior siege units. Another benefit to talk about the Hojo, for instance, is that they can get artillery, which is actually a fairly late game unit, but they can get an artillery unit in the fire projecting mangonels early on as an objective reward. So generally speaking, when you're playing a campaign over here, you will get some kind of reward to match the playstyle of your particular daimyo. So there are various campaigns to play as with their own focus. The Takeda focus on cavalry, the Oda focus on Ashigari units, the Shimazu focus on katanas, the Uesugi focus on warrior monks. That is the differentiation between the different daimyos, the different campaigns. It is similar in Fall of Samurai, though there is a difference there in the sense that there is also a clear-cut difference between traditionalism and modernization. Whereas traditional units can be good in melee, whereas modern units with Gatling guns and cannons can devastate pretty much anything in their path. Though really a mix of traditional and modern units is probably the way to go in that particular title. So how do things play out? Well, there are some severe downsides with regards to the campaign design, in particular with diplomacy. So I've created the Hojo Shogunate, I've gained a significant amount of land, but now everyone hates me. What's annoying about it is how it happens. So the more territory you do take, the more your diplomatic relations with other factions will be affected. That is an annoying thing in itself, but they're just seeing you as a threat. The annoying thing is like once you become a real threat, you get the realm divide aspect, which will also hurt you in a significant fashion. Diplomacy certainly is the really bad aspect of this particular campaign. It just isn't a great situation. So in this stage, if I want to maintain my alliance with the Takeda, basically I'm gonna have to keep giving them money gifts in order to make nice with them. Or if I, wanted to get a peace treaty with the Chosukabe, and let's say a trade agreement, which they wouldn't violate so easily, let's say we give them, actually more, let's say 5. Alright. Well, they're not going to be willing to embrace that. Okay. And, yep. And got the peace treaty with the Chosukabe. Though that was basically all of my money. So it can be annoying from that perspective, having to deal with the diplomatic aspect, especially the fact that as you reach a certain point, everyone is basically going to unite against you. I understand the intent of this, where they're trying to create an endgame that is meaningful, but the problem is it ruins any kind of potential of alliances. Basically means that you can only view alliances as temporary, and you don't have the ability of scoring a diplomatic victory. So it really ends up hurting the campaign from that perspective. The other campaign mechanics, that is a different situation that ends up working quite well. So here's how things work. You have castles, and these castles, the more you get them up to a higher level, well, each castle has a repression. So the higher level of a castle, the more you will keep the population under control easier. And this will also increase the recruitment capacity and also increase the number of building slots the higher level on a castle. So if you want to have all of these building slots, 5 building slots, then you need to get a citadel castle, which requires a significant amount of resources, also requires you to control stone resources on the campaign map, which you can't trade for, which is unfortunate. So the campaign, again, one of the things that also hurts you on diplomacy, because you do need some of these resources to make it work. So you need stone to increase, to get to the highest level of castles, and castles will give you building slots. You are pushed towards specializing certain provinces with regards to structures. I do wonder if I have any. Yeah, I do. Typically speaking, there aren't that many buildings. So you get various temples, various economic buildings or agent buildings and encampment, and various unit recruitment buildings. That's in the castle town. Then you have the province itself. The province itself, every province will have food production and also economic production with farms. Then you have roads, which increase replenishment and also give movement speed increase for armies on the campaign in that particular province. And then you have ports. Those are the three basic ones, though there are provinces without ports. You are always going to have roads. You're always going to have farms. You may not. You, in a lot of cases, will have ports, but you may not have. Them. Then there are certain unique resources, like for instance, gold mines over here in this particular province. In the Izo province, you have access to gold mines, and this is a benefit for the Hojo because it really increases their initial economic potential on the campaign side of things. So that is how it works when it comes to structures. But here's the thing. A lot of things, actually the vast majority of structures, and the vast majority of structures are going to be locked behind research. So if you want to improve roads, if you want to improve farms, you need research. If you want to recruit katana samurai, and that requires a sword school, you're going to need research. If you want to recruit bow samurai, that's going to require research, and so on and so forth. So you're going to need a significant amount of research, so a lot of things are locked behind research. And what's annoying about this, unfortunately, and this is why I'd strongly recommend getting a mod like this one that basically makes research only take one turn, is that you can't get everything by default, and you're basically pushed in the direction of getting the things you want. So for instance, you will generally want to get katana samurai and bow samurai. After that, you're probably going to go on to get some, you're probably going to want to get a market for Mitsuke. Buddhist temple as well is pretty useful. Then improve roads. And you may also want to get certain naval units. But for instance, gunpowder units require a significant amount of research that's very deep in. And it takes this long. Like actually, it takes a significant amount of research to get any kind of basic artillery in the Sengoku Jidai period. And it takes a significant amount of research to be able to get any kind of gunpowder unit. And that is an annoying situation to have to deal with. So a mod that improves this makes it far better. I do dislike the gatekeeping. I think Creative Assembly did that in order to limit the campaign potential. So there's a nice toolbox to access over here, but it is locked behind research. Like in this campaign, initially, I just played this entire campaign with a basic research tree. And while I did use mods to vastly improve my economy, that's the reason I have so much money and so many armies, I ended up in this boring situation where I'm just running around with bow samurai, katana samurai, and yari samurai, but not really all that much else. Well, some cavalry as well, but not necessarily all that much else. I think this campaign would have been far more interesting had I been able to use artillery, gunpowder units, all that. And by the way, the AI will also cheat with respect to this, so the AI will get access to a wider variety of things, a wider variety of units earlier on, though the AI also is not necessarily that great, so the AI can end up just spamming Yari Ashigaru or long Yari Ashigaru, which is not a great situation to deal with on the campaign map. So the diplomacy is not great, the research is not great. What I do like, however, is the fact that is the province system in itself. So you have these structures that can be raided. You don't have minor settlement battles. Like these would basically be the minor settlements as you would have them in Warhammer 3, for instance, or post-Rome 2. There's various periods in Total War. So you have the initial period, which covered Shogun 1 and Medieval 1. Then you have the Rome 1 period, which includes Rome 1, expansions, Medieval 2. And then you have the Empire period, which covers Empire, Napoleon, and Shogun 2. And this settlement system is part of Empire. These structures that you have the campaign map that are crucial towards your Empire running is a significant part of that. Rome 2 moved to the minor settlement system. I think the system ends up being better. So because you don't end up with a significant number of minor settlement battles, which is certainly one of the problems of Warhammer 3. Now, I'm not necessarily fond of having every every province requiring a siege to win. But what's great about Shogun 2 is that if you show up with a full stack at a minor settlement, even with a mon like Radius, which by the way improves the garrisons, you show up with a full stack, you will be able to auto-resolve against the garrison. They will not be able to stand up against you, so you don't have to deal with the annoying grind that really ruins Warhammer 3, for instance, where every single minor garrison you pretty much have to fight because you'll take significant casualties otherwise. Though that is certainly exclusive to Warhammer 3, it's not a problem in other Total War games, it's because of the defensive supply system and how it wasn't originally envisioned by Creative Assembly, not a great system over there at all. Now, the castles do require food. So if you're going to build a higher level castle, you will need to maintain a certain level of food production in order to not starve. If you do start starving, things are going to get nasty very, very quickly. And your economy is heavily dependent on these farms, because while you certainly can and will generate money from the castle settlements themselves, the bulk of your economy is going to be built with farms and other structures that are in the province, not in the castle itself. So provincial control, so actually properly accounting for raiders, is an important aspect. Another thing to like about this game is that you don't need a general to have an army on the map. Now, there are certainly some annoyances with this, where it's like the AI has this tendency of sending single entity units or single units to just annoy the crap out of you. Also over here, like, there's 3 different armies, one of which doesn't have a general. Then there's another one, small one, another one over here. I've been assassinating generals left and right. We do have the mega edge agents in Shogun 2, where, like, you've got agents that can just completely obliterate enemy armies on their own or significantly slow them down in a fairly swift fashion. Regardless, you do have that kind of flexibility because you don't have to worry about supply lines, and you don't have to worry about armies being led by a general, which was certainly something that was added in Rome 2. Like, with regards to Total War, we've never really moved past the core design philosophy of Rome 2. We have adapted it, Creative Assembly has adapted it, but it's never moved past that. So it is great to play a game that doesn't feel like some kind of variation of Rome 2, which is not a great game. Speaking about agents, we do have the following agents to talk about. So we have ninjas. What ninjas can do is they can sabotage armies, assassinate leaders, establish spy networks, or sabotage buildings, or just scout for an army. Then you have Mitsuke, which are kind of like a police force, basically. They can apprehend enemy agents, and they can bribe enemy leaders. They can bribe enemy armies and settlements as well. And agents can also improve the public order or the population happiness in settlements. Then you have monks as well. If I can find a particular monk, there we go, we have one. Now, monks deal with religion, so they can minister to a settlement to improve public happiness. They can incite a revolt in an enemy settlement. Things are very expensive with agents, but the actions they can take are pretty powerful, or demoralize an army. In Follow Samurai, you have Geisha, which can negatively affect an army, but they can also enchant a general. Now, you can get the general on your side from the enemy with bribery using Mitsuke, or you can use a Geisha and Follow Samurai to just get the general, but you won't get the army, so you might leave him in a vulnerable position. Useful to use before a battle, though, because an army not having a general, like, you can move armies, you can move units without a general on a campaign map, and if you win battles with an army like, let's say this one, then you will get an event for someone to rise through the ranks, and you make them a general. But an armies without proper general unit will be significantly weaker than ones with. And that's something to keep in mind. And then you have the foreign veteran. He can duel. He can, like, the way agent actions work is a bit different from Follow Samurai, but foreign veteran is mainly there to train, campaign movement range, and improving your units. When it comes to the generals and your daimyo, your faction leader, you have loyalty for your regular generals, so that reflects how loyal they are. And loyalty is, I think, important as well for morale, if I'm not mistaken. Honor for your daimyo is important for diplomacy and important for your public order, happiness in a particular territory. So there are certain things. Like, for instance, here with the honor I have, I get +1 to public order in my campaign. So some of the things to keep in mind. Honor may also, I think, affect the loyalty of your generals, if I'm not wrong about that. So I could be wrong. Yeah, so for instance, over here, he's got +3 loyalty because of my daimyo honor. So it's important to keep your faction leader alive, especially the one you start with, because, like, for instance, if he died, the person who would take over, he may not necessarily, actually in his case, he probably would be able to do quite well as a leader. But for instance, if you lose your faction leader and you only have underage children, and basically you have a regency council, that can create a lot of issues. That can create a lot of issues in your campaign. Basically, is campaign over. Keeping generals, like keeping your faction leader alive throughout all of this, is pretty important. Now, I do think that Creative Assembly was right to make immortal generals in Total War, because while you as the player can generally keep your general alive or faction leader alive throughout all of it, the issue is the AI will not. So the AI will lose their faction leaders quite easily. I think Takeda Shingen did stay alive over here, but many other faction leaders did not. So for instance, Uesugi Kenshin died quite a while ago. So that is an issue to deal with on the campaign side of things. Like immortal generals, for the AI at least, would have made things significantly better, I think. So I think Creative Assembly did, like, it's one thing though to point out that having aging or having situations where they can die would be good, but not for just a simple battle or general sniping or a battle out resolve that the AI got itself in. Doesn't end up working so well, because you end up with a lot of these situations where many of these factions may not be led by a proper leader at all and are just led by like some peasant who's in charge, though there are some proper leaders as well for these factions, as you can see. Overall, my conclusion about Shogun 2 is that it's a game that runs fairly well, handles modern systems pretty well, though it's certainly a more limited campaign, especially if you're playing without mods. But even with mods, it's not necessarily going to move from that. It was designed as a more limited campaign, and that is something that is shown. The problem that is that the replayability factor may not necessarily be all that great, though individual campaigns can be a lot of fun. And I'm certainly the kind of person who believes that having one good and memorable campaign is far more important than being able to play a dozen different campaigns. Because if you're playing a dozen different campaigns, the individual experiences of those campaigns is probably not going to match a game where they focus on making one really, really good campaign. And that's what Shogun 2 does best, from my perspective. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.